Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We are learning Mishnah's Bava Kamma, Parak Vav, Chapter 6, Mishnah Beis, Mishnah 2. All right. Now, Hinicha B'chama. You've got this animal, and you put it in a pen. You lock the door properly. You close. It's a door that's able to withstand the normal wind. You've done your part to go ahead, at least from the point of the door that closes the pen. You've done what you're supposed to do. However, you left it in the sun, and it got very hot. And because it got very hot, it started acting up. It got wild, and it broke out of the pen. So it's really a unusual situation. Under normal circumstances, the door would have been strong enough to hold the animal in there. But now because you left it in the sun, that's what caused it to go wild, and it broke through the door anyway. Or you handed it over to be watched, but you handed it over to either a deaf mute, an insane person, or a minor, which are not people that are considered halachically responsible. V'yatsa v'hizika, and they went, and now because of that, the animal went down and damaged. Chayiv, you, the owner of the animal, are going to be liable. You're going to be obligated to pay. You're considered negligent. In the case where you give it over to these kinds of people to watch, these are not people who are responsible enough to watch, therefore you're negligent in your watching. And in the case before, as we mentioned, although the door that was in front of the pen was locked properly and closed properly from the point of the door, or the point of a wind or something regular, because you left it in the heat, that made the animal go a little bit, go crazy, and because of that, it went out and it damaged. I have to interrupt and mention that the Day of Learning has been sponsored by Tzivia Fine in memory of her grandmother Chanuhinda Bas Binyamin Lipa, the Neshama Shavan Aliyah.
Amen.
Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Next, now we're going to read the Mishnah as it says, and then there's a lot of explanation to this. Misara Laroya, you handed over the animal to a shepherd. That means the shepherd now has to watch it for you, right? That's what you gave it to the shepherd to do, to watch it. Nichnas Roya Tachtov. The shepherd takes the place of the owner. Nichnas Roya Tachtov. The shepherd enters in his place. That means that we're talking about now giving over to adult shepherd, a competent adult shepherd. So now we say the shepherd takes his place. The shepherd now becomes obligated to watch the animal and make sure it doesn't damage. And if it does damage, who has to pay? The shepherd. Now, the Bartanura points this out, and I'm going to read to you from the bottom, that although this sounds pretty basic, right? He gave it over to a shepherd. The shepherd's obligated to guard it, which includes now that it has to make sure it doesn't do damages. So they bring down here that the Gemara objects that these laws have already been taught in Mishnah 4:9. This idea has already been learned, so why is it being repeated here? Therefore, the Gemara explains that the Mishnah refers to a special case where the owner entrusted his sheep to a shepherd, and then that shepherd gave it to his assistant to watch. So that's the story. The shepherd gave it over to another shepherd. Now, the general rule is that if the owner of an object entrusts it to a shomer, to someone to guard it, and the shomer hands it over to another shomer, the first shomer remains responsible for the object because the owner did not give him permission to entrust it to anyone else. Okay? So shomer shemasal shomer chayev. Shomer hands over to another shomer is going to be obligated because he had no permission to give it over to somebody else. In our case, then, the first shepherd should remain responsible for the sheep even after he gave it to his assistant. The Mishnah teaches that this is not so. Rather, the first shepherd ceases to be responsible and the assistant takes his place. Since it is standard practice for a shepherd to entrust his sheep to his assistants, the owner of the sheep presumably expected this to happen, and it is as though he gave permission. The responsibility for the sheep was thus transferred to the assistant, and it is he who must pay for any damage. So the point is that although typically you give it to a shepherd, it has to stay by that shepherd, but if the shepherd is going to give it to his assistant, which is a very normal practice, then basically the owner who gave it over to the shepherd understands that's the normal practice, and it's considered like he gave permission to do so. Therefore, it's the assistant to the shepherd who is now the new shomer, the new guard, and he's the one who's now responsible to guard the animal for any kind of damage. So when the Mishnah says Misara l'Raya, he gave it to the shepherd, Nichnas Raya Tachtav, it really means after the owner gave it to one shepherd, the shepherd gave it over to another shepherd, specifically his assistant, and then we say the shepherd enters in his place, in the place of the first shomer, to be responsible for any damage that takes place. Okay, next. Nafla Legina V'Nehenis. The animal fell into a garden. We call it a garden patch. It means it's where, for example, what happened here? The sheep was walking on its owner's roof that is next to the garden, or in a public area that is above the garden, and accidentally slipped. Okay, so the animal is not in a bad place. You're not negligent in where the animal is. The animal is in a regular place. The animal slipped and now fell into the garden. And now by falling into the garden, what happened? Either what happened is the crops were crushed because they cushioned the sheep's fall, okay, and that's how they got damaged. Or we're talking about once the sheep fell in, it said, oh, look at all this food around me, and it started eating. In both these cases, the Mishnah says, not looking of an hennis. Let's say it fell into a garden and it had benefit. The animal benefited from falling into the garden. Mishalemes mashenehenis, the owner must pay what he benefited from these crops. Now what that means is like this. The point is that when the animal fell in, it was considered an einus. It was beyond his control. He was not negligent in how it fell in. And therefore, to go ahead and say that it has to pay for damages, that we're not going to say because he's not responsible. He guarded it properly. What happened was an accident beyond his control, not expected, and therefore he's not considered negligent and he's not responsible for the damages. But who he is responsible is to pay what he benefited. The fact that if the animal, by falling into this garden, benefited from the fact that it ruined those crops that it fell on top of, the owner now has to pay what he benefited. Now what that means is like this. Although the owner does not have to pay for causing damage, he's not a mazik, he must pay for what he benefited. It is a general rule that whenever someone benefits from the property of another and thereby causes the owner some loss, he must pay at least for the benefit. It's not going to be full damages, which we'll see what that full damages would mean, but it means he has to pay the benefit. He has to pay what he benefited from what happened here. What he benefited at the loss of this other person. How to calculate the benefit that the sheep received depends on how the crops were damaged. If they were eaten, the sheep's owner must pay what it would have cost him to feed his animal with sheep animal food. Basically, he saved supper that night. He doesn't have to feed his animal. The animal ate from this. He doesn't have to. Now he has to feed his animal. Okay, so now what does that mean? So we're saying he has to pay, the amount what he would have fed his animal. Now doesn't have to. Now that's what he has to pay. That's his benefit. But it doesn't mean. But the way to measure what he would have fed his animal is he could have fed his animal the cheapest food around. That would have sufficed. So even if, let's say, the food that he typically gives is at a higher price, but at the end of the day, what did he benefit? He saved him a meal. What could the meal have been? Could have been cheap stuff. And therefore, the obligation to pay for what he benefited is what he would he has to pay the cost of what it would have cost him to feed his animal with cheap animal food. But that's if the animal ate. What if the animal just crushed, meaning it fell on top, it cushioned its fall, and it crushed it. It ruined it because it crushed it. So then, if they were crushed by the sheep's fall, the owner is liable for the amount he would have paid to cushion his animal's fall and prevent it from being injured. It's a very interesting way of assessing things. You have to look at it. What did it benefit? That it got cushioned. It fell. It didn't hurt itself. Well, what would you pay, right, to have a cushion there, to have something to cushion your animal's fall if it would fall? That is what you get. That is what you benefited from. That's how you benefited, and that is what you have to pay the owner whose crops were damaged. Okay, we will pick this up from here tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.